I'm here with Bill Barnard, calling in from Houston, Texas.
Dallas.
I'm going to do that one over. I'm going to
Do
edit that
again?
out. I'm here with Bill Barnard, calling in from Dallas, Texas. Bill, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Sure. My pleasure.
I started this podcast in 2018. And a big part of what led me to begin the podcast and this exploration of what I call the medicine path, which I really feel is anybody's path of growth and transformation and healing, was my experiences in the Santo Daime Church, beginning back in about 2010. And there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about Santo Daime or sing some of the hymns, even though it's been about probably 7 years since I've done an official work.
Wow.
So Santo Daime's got a very special place in my heart, and I've wanted to talk about it on the podcast, for the past 4 years. So thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, well, you've just published a book called Liquid Light, which I have here, where you speak about your experiences in the Santo Daime and offer some of your thoughts based on being a theologian. Is that right?
Well, I'm a religious studies professor. It's a slight difference. Theologians are typically understood to be people who are sort of restricted. Like, so most theologians historically have been Christians who self-identify as Christians and then work within the fairly exclusively Christian framework. Religious studies professors are people who are more overtly, often at least, comparative in their focus, and certainly at least religiously neutral and even-handed. There's no privileging of any one religious tradition. So it's a slight orientation.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that distinction.
Yeah.
So why did you decide to write this book at this time?
Well, I actually decided to write it about 14 years ago. It just took me that long to write it. I was actually doing a Santo Daime work, which is the word, they said it's a translation of the Portuguese trabalho, which is what in the Santo Daime we use to refer to the ceremonies of the Santo Daime. I was doing the Santo Daime work, and I had been participating in the Santo Daime just for my own spiritual interest and desire for several years. And then it just became clear to me, it's like, oh, I have the training, and it just felt like there was just some inner sort of tug on the sleeve or a tap on the shoulder, however, whatever metaphor you want, that just sort of said, hey, it seems like you should do this. So I work hard to follow those inner nudges. And so the first thing I needed to do was I reached out to, there wasn't a lot that had been written about the Santo Daime. So I reached out to this one scholar who had written at that point an article about the Santo Daime, and said, any advice for me? I'm thinking about doing this. And he said, well, you need to learn Portuguese. And so that was my first.
Aaron Dawson?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, there was a book previous to yours, which when I got introduced to the Santo Daime, the person who introduced me to it said, okay, before you come to a work, read this book called Forest of Visions by Alex Polari.
Oh.
And I think it's since been republished under the title of Religion of Ayahuasca, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It was the book that turned me on to the Santo Daime as well. As I mentioned in Liquid Light. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think part of that is because there's such a strict policy against proselytizing in the Santo Daime, right? Like, do you think that's the main reason why more hasn't been written about it, particularly from the inside?
I'm not sure. because I certainly don't think of this book as proselytization at all. It's really just an attempt to, because, you know, within the Santo Daime tradition, it's fine to share about your experiences, but without any intent, like you say, to proselytize or to convert or to pressure anyone. So I just wanted to, I had been immersed in this tradition for so long that I, you know, was having powerful experiences, and they made me really think even more deeply about the nature of consciousness, which had been the focus of my academic life for several decades. I mean, my first book was written on William James, an American philosopher and psychologist who wrote arguably the first comparative text on mystical experience from a psychological standpoint, which was just brilliant. And then my second book was on Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher and a close friend of William James, who was also deeply interested in the nature of consciousness, like James was, and both of them were interested in altered states of consciousness, and especially mystical experience, which was my focus as an academic. And so it's like when I began with the Santo Daime to have pretty profound visionary mystical experiences on a fairly regular basis, you know, I really wanted to you know, think through some of the implications of what it meant to have these types of experiences for my own understanding of the nature of consciousness more generally. And just to be able to give people a really vivid, visceral sense of what it would be like from the inside and outside to take part in these different works. You know, so in some ways, I think of the book as a type of a literary mediumship, in a sense. It's like a way for people almost in and through me to sort of experience vicariously what it's like to be a Daimista. Someone who, a regular practitioner in the Santo Daime tradition.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you described religious studies professor remaining neutral spiritually. So did you have any hesitations about writing from such a personal perspective in this book?
No, I didn't have any hesitations, but I knew I had to address that issue right up front, because as I mentioned in the introduction in the book, I'm really, to my mind, consciously addressing three very distinct audiences. I'm addressing fellow Daimistas, people who are also you know, regular participants in this path of the Santo Daime. I'm addressing people who are just interested in psychedelics, especially psychedelic spirituality more generally. And I'm addressing fellow academics, right? And there is some contention within the field of religious studies about, you know, the issue of objectivity, subjectivity, neutrality, all of these sorts of things have been really thought through. And I think it's safe to say that while it's not unanimous, that certainly at least most of the religious studies people that I'm close to, there's sort of I think an understanding, a pretty clear understanding that it is very possible, in fact, it's almost not possible to not have this, that a person can be very reflexive about their own self-location. In fact, that's really sort of needed to, that any sort of pretense of absolute neutrality, as if you're not a human being, as if you're just sort of an invisible cipher, is really a pretense. It's not, and it's not accurate to where we are, that we all bring our own issues, our assumptions, our view of the world, our sense of ourselves into whatever we're writing and teaching. And so that it's really good actually to be pretty transparent about that. And so I had to sort of flesh that out a little bit, and yet to talk about also, especially with this in terms of this subject, talk about the importance of writing from a first person standpoint, especially when you're writing about the nature of consciousness, because there's such a tendency, and I think it has to do with a lot to do with the prestige of the hard sciences, to that sort of the best way to write about something is from a third person distance perspective. And And I tried to make a pretty strong case that when you're talking about these types of topics about the nature of inner experience, you need to write from that place, right? Not just from some sort of removed distance. And so, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it definitely gives the writing some more gravitas, maybe, you know, that you're someone who's been in on the inside, had these experiences yourself. And yeah, so I appreciate it. And I noticed, like in the book, how carefully you walk that line, and you're very careful about explaining if something is your subjective experience and things like that.
Yeah.
Did you receive any kind of resistance from fellow Daimistas when you talked to them about writing this book? Was anyone kind of critical of you doing that?
At first, there was one person for sure who got a little reactive. He had only read a couple of early excerpts from a couple of chapters, and but I was really careful. I ended up, because I wanted this is very much my book in terms of I want to own responsibility for whatever. So no one else is to blame, so to speak, for the book. But it was very much a collaborative work too, in the sense that I shared numerous editions of the manuscript with people, not only with other Daimistas, but also other scholars, and trying to, again, sort of get feedback and suggestions. And so I really benefited a lot from that. And so the Daimistas that I knew, I mean, one of the most important readers of the book was this fellow Daimista who was also a well-trained in religious studies. So he was able to sort of bridge those two, and he gave careful readings of it, and very thoughtful, very heartfelt, and gave me extensive feedback. And it was just I so much appreciated it. And then actually, there was we actually have a sort of a national organization here in North America that they created what they called a media committee, not just for my book, but there was a media committee that was already, actually, I think it was already put together, but they took on the job of reading the book and sort of vetting it. I was very clear, though. I said, I'm not looking for censorship, and they didn't really do that. They were really, and they just read it and actually were extremely supportive. And one member of that committee gave me extensive, very helpful feedback as well, more on the style of it actually than anything else. And so I very much appreciated the feedback I got on the whole. And even that one person, I think, ended up coming around. Here's hoping, because he's a good friend of mine. So, and that's the thing, right? These people are friends of mine, and they're people that I've known and shared amazing experiences with. And so, when I'm writing this, I'm wanting to tell, and I talk about this, I'm sort of a warts and all view of the Santo Daime. I don't want to produce some sort of, I think some people may have hoped that I was going to produce this really sort of fit for public consumption, sort of like polished, like here's this idealized sort of religious group. And to me, as a religious scholar, and for someone to take me seriously, it's like no, it's like, this is a real robust human religion, meaning that it's got all sorts of people that with differing opinions, and it's a living tradition that's not by any means idealized, and it's a full three-dimensional religious tradition, and I wanted to depict that in all of its robustness, right, in the book, and also too, right. And so it's like we sometimes I write about this also, that some of the other there have been some books written on the Santo Daime. Certainly there's a lot of academic work on ayahuasca religions more generally, especially in South America. And most of that, though, is from an anthropological perspective. And a lot of it's just, of course, in Portuguese, but a lot of, there's some in English. And when you read it, you like wonder, like, I would often say to myself, I know lots of these people. I know they've drank a lot of ayahuasca or daime, but you would never know it from reading because they're trying so hard to be quote unquote objective, and there's a type of rhetoric that's very sort of I hate to say it, sort of dry. This is academic writing, that I know very well and I'm fine with. And it's very, for me as a scholar, it's actually very helpful. It's talking about, the legal issues or the economic issues or the, political issues, all these sort of things that people are interested in, understandably. But I'm interested in the nature of consciousness. I'm interested in like who we are under the surface and who we could become as human beings. And those more philosophical or metaphysical or normative questions are what really drive my interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things about the Santo Daime too, like that I find fascinating, is that it's a fairly new religion that, like you said, is alive and is continually evolving.
Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of impossible to speak about it as one thing.
Good point.
If the Daime is anything, it's a reflection of Brazilian culture, in that it's very syncretic, it's very eclectic,
Exactly.
and alive.
Oh no, for sure. And like I say, multifaceted. There's lots of streams of the Santo Daime, and it's very, especially the lineage that I belong to, that was carried on by Padrinho Sebastião after the death of Mestre Irineo, the founder of the religion. He was very syncretistic and very eclectic, very open to all these influences from different streams of religiosity. But the original was too. I mean, Mestre Irineo combined basically folk Catholicism and indigenous religion, and to an esoteric traditions and Eastern traditions, because he had his whole group for about 6 years, maybe 7 years, affiliate with this a type of sort of theosophical organization that was very prominent, as far as I know, may still be prominent in Brazil, called the Esoteric Circle of the Communion of Thought, which was sort of an attempt in Brazil to, weave together lots of influences by, Madame Blavatsky and Steiner and anthroposophy and theosophy, and as well as people like Yogananda and Vivekananda and the sort of the more Eastern yogic traditions. And so that was even there from the very get-go in the Daime. But then you got Padrinho Sebastião, who added all basically brought in mediumship was the real issue, and especially through the Spiritist line, which he was part of. And then he was very welcoming when this woman named Baixinha, who was what's called the Mãe de Santo of an Umbanda tradition, which is sort of itself classically, as you put, classically Brazilian syncretistic movement that combines Catholicism and Spiritism and African religiosity, and is a mediumistically based tradition. He welcomed her very beautifully and powerfully into the Santo Daime religion. And so there's all these streams of it. And so you have different people that resonate with different aspects of that. And then you've got this extremely potent sacrament, which that's for us what the Daime is. It's a sacrament. It's not even of course it is medicinal. It's very, I think, powerfully and beautifully medicinal. But for us, it's a sacrament, right? It's a way to commune with the divine. And so it's an agent of revelation, of ongoing revelation. So it's not with the Daime that you're just having to sort of refer back to some ancient text of way back when in some other culture, some people you don't even know had these profound visionary experiences. You begin to have them yourself, right? And all your friends begin to have them. And it's like a shared world of visionary / mystical experience. And that's not all of what the Daime is. I used to think that was the major focus, but really it's also a very devotional path. It's really, it's these received hymns that are, and it's where everyone's singing together, and hopefully with a lot of heart, and sometimes it can be literally ecstatic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And
Yeah, well, I think that speaks to that quality of aliveness of the tradition. So one of the things that's really unique about the Santo Daime is that the doctrine is held in a whole collection of hymns, of
yeah,
songs
yeah,
that have been received by members since the beginning
yeah,
and continue to be received. And
yeah.
so members of local churches will start to receive their own hymns, which then get incorporated into the larger doctrine.
Yeah,
And that, I mean, there's something Quaker-like about that, where everybody has the potential to be a channel for this doctrine, which is very
yeah,
egalitarian. And I
yeah.
found it just incredibly refreshing.
Oh, me too. And and so what you have with the Daime, the Santo, I make a distinction in the book, and it's just sort of it's just for convenience sake. I make a distinction, use the word Daime to refer to the sacrament itself, and then I use the term Santo Daime to refer to the tradition. Most Daimistas sort of mix and match that, but I'll try to be a little more consistent with that. So like in the Santo Daime tradition, you're right. There are lots of people who've received hymns, and the receiving of these hymns is very mysterious and very beautiful, and it's part of this process where you don't consciously seek to create a hymn. You literally, like you said, you receive it, and so like at this point I've received I've received 36 hymns, and I write about this in the end of the book, what it's like to receive hymns, because no one's, as far as I know, no one's ever written about that.
Hmm.
And it is a really fascinating process, because on the one hand, it doesn't come at all from the ego. There's no will, there's no forcing, there's no intentionality behind it. You literally, it's like, feels like I'm taking dictation or something. They often come to me in dreams, or there's just sort of almost like a download that happens. And yet I'm always struck that how each person's set of hymns has a particular sort of energetic cohesiveness to it. They really sort of reveal who that person is. So to me, my hymns, for example, are very pure expressions of the depths of my being, even though I had nothing to do with creating them. It's sort of a fascinating paradoxical process that happens.
Yeah. Well, it's like, you said that the Santo Daime is multifaceted. And one of the ways it's multifaceted is like what we talked about, where everybody who's involved with it is another facet of this kind of, we could think of it as a jewel or a crystal. And so the divine light then passing through that gets refracted in different ways, depending on what your particular facet is made of or what it looks like, right?
That's a beautiful way to think about it. I love it, because, and especially because in the Daime we talk about a lot of the hymns speak about what it calls the crystalline light, or the crystal light, and so it's that same sort of notion of and I even talk about this in the book. Even the visionary experiences seem to be often angular, like as if it's the refractions of light, and I've noticed there's a sort of an angularity about sometimes even about the bodily postures that happen during mediumship, which is another component, at least of our lineage of the Santo Daime, because again, like that's what Padrinho Sebastião was sort of brought in. There wasn't really mediumship per se in early Santo Daime.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to talk about that because it's a very intriguing aspect of the tradition. But just to speak to what you said about receiving hymns, I received a hymn, and it was, the first hymn I received was like the day after a work.
Yeah.
And I was down at a friend's house down in Oregon, and I was taking a shower, And as the water was hitting me, all of a sudden this song came into my head.
Yeah.
And it was, like you said, it wasn't something that I wrote, but it was something that I actually had to learn. Like it came like fully formed,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
I had to learn it, and I had to figure out, oh, these are the guitar chords that go with it.
Yeah.
And it was something that, I've had to live with in terms of understanding the content of that hymn, actually.
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
that way, it does feel truly received from
Oh, yeah.
someplace other than my ego. That's as much as I'll say about it. Whether that comes from, up there, or it's like an upload from the heart, is sometimes the way I think of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. I'm so glad to hear that you had. Yeah, and for me, like I'm really pretty much a terrible musician. I have almost no melodic memory. My rhythmic ability is very much a work in progress, and so I just sing the melodies into my iPod, my iPhone, and that's been the real grace for me. And actually, when I started there, I didn't have an iPhone, and so I just a little tape recorder I carried around, and thank God for that, or I'd be lost. So it's a fascinating process, right? Because it feels like if they're really received, they're for me specifically, the messages, the teachings, but it also feels like it's got a broader potential, at least, message outreach, so that if other people get a chance to hear them, hopefully they'll resonate with them as well, right? Right. So.
Yeah. Well, you've talked about the history of the Santo Daime on Soul Speaks podcast, and I've heard other people speak about it. I think it's fairly commonly known, or at least the information is readily available. So
Yeah.
rather than kind of go over that again, what I'm really interested in talking with you about today is the creation of different lines, like we've already alluded to, and maybe the differences between them. um, and I think there's like new lines continually being created, or kind of new, what's the word, like evolutions of the work as
Yeah.
it comes
Yeah.
to different places around the world, and I find that just incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, no, it's just so that your listeners can know. I mean, I've created a website also for the book. It's called liquidlightbook.com. And on that website, I do try. I have, like, for instance, a very focused, to me, very focused as a scholar, biography of Mastery that I wrote, or at least maybe biography is a little too formal a term, but it's a concise, focused description of the major issues that surrounded what happened during his life, and the context in which his life unfolded, and the teachings. And I'm going to have another one for Padrinho Sebastião that, God willing, will happen, hopefully in a few months, be finished with that. And I also have there something called Santo Daime 101, which gives the real bedrock basics of the teachings and the ritual practices and the history of the Santo Daime. So yeah, all that's easily, accessible. And so you're right. I just wanted to, like, that website's a really good resource for that. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. Now it gets really complicated.
Sorry, Bill, what's the URL of your website? Because it's probably a great place for people to go, where all that information is collected, and not in poorly translated Portuguese, right?
Exactly, that's the thing. It's liquidlightbook.com.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and so yeah, it is. I mean, I don't know of another, a lot. I won't claim that Mastery's biography is breaking any new ground. It's not like there's this beautiful book in Portuguese called El Vinho de Longe, which is this massive, incredibly well-researched biography. That's a real biography of Mastery, but it's in Portuguese and it's huge. And So what I tried to do is to gather together all these resources, like you said, from these different Portuguese sources, and try to just like cut down, like in my mind, the essentials of his life, which is just fascinating, and doing the same thing with Padrinho Sebastião. And so hopefully it'll be a resource, I think, especially for Dionysius, but if anyone happened to wanted to know more about the Santo Daime, the history of it, that's hopefully going to be an ongoing resource that'll just keep getting better.
Yeah, well, and while we're speaking to that too, if people are interested in the hymns of Santo Daime, a friend of mine, Ben Tobias from Seattle, has created a website called Nossa Irmandade, which is an incredible resource for people interested in the music of Santo Daime.
Oh gosh, and thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
You, Ben. I mean, you're right. It's like an amazing resource for the hymns of the Santo Daime.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's talk about Padrinho Sebastião, who is the founder of, I guess, the line that you've been most involved with, right?
Yeah.
And also all of the works that I was involved with followed that particular line too. And it has some things that do distinguish it from kind of, I hate these words, but like the original line of Mestre Irineu, which I believe is called Alto Santo.
Santo. Yeah.
And so let's just talk about that. So when did Sebastião come on the scene?
Oh my goodness. I'm so bad with dates, but let's say oh my goodness. I think in the just early 60s, maybe. I can look that up. But yeah, he came in sort of as the history of the Daime goes, somewhat late onto the scene, and that the first work of the Santo Daime officially was in 1930, right? So there's at least like probably around over 3 decades before Padrinho Sebastião shows up. And so that itself was sort of is significant in that, there were people that were real long-time, deeply dedicated, deeply devoted disciples of Mestre Irineu that had been with him for a long time. And here this guy comes in, and Padrinho Sebastião was already himself, before meeting the Daime, a spiritist medium and healer. And he had been trained way in the middle of the Amazon rainforest by this one spiritist medium and healer called Mestre Osvaldo, who was literally, I mean, Padrinho Sebastião heard about him and had to travel like a day or two in a canoe to try to find this guy, and then became basically sort of an apprentice with him. And finally, Mestre Osvaldo basically told Padrinho Sebastião, and he wasn't Padrinho Sebastião, Padrinho is an honorific, so it's told Sebastião Moto Gimeo, hey, your spiritual calling is in Rio Branco, and really encouraged him to leave the forest and to go to this, from our perspective, a fairly rustic capital city of Acre, but still, a city. And Padrinho Sebastião had been raised all of his life way in the middle of the rainforest. And
just to orient people listening, Acre is a province of Brazil up in the northwest corner.
A state, yeah. It used to be a province, and now it's a state. And far northwest, right on the edge of Peru and Bolivia. And
so kind of the heart of ayahuasca in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Because that's where Mestre Irineu's church began, was in Acre, on the outskirts of Rio Branco. And so he ended up, Padrinho Sebastião ended up joining with basically his wife's extended family, and started farming, but he also began to be, he brought that healing and mediumistic expertise and charisma into that sort of extended family situation. And so was already himself a very respected and loved healer. But he came down with this very mysterious and very intense and long-lasting disease that was really difficult for him to work with and for his family to work with, and it was just very debilitating. And so he tried all these different, standard medical options, but it didn't work. And so he ended up going to Mestre Irineu, because Mestre Irineu was known as a world-class healer. And that's most of the original disciples came to him for healing, and stayed because he healed them. And because this is a world that, standard medicine is it's not really, you don't have a lot of doctors and nurses, and, you have some, but not much. And so he came, and he did his first Santo Daime work with Mestre, and had a very, very powerful out-of-body experience where these what they call these spirit doctors, these doctors that literally, like with white robes and things, appeared to him and cut him open and extracted 3 insects or parasites or something from his liver, and then sewed him back together, and then he came back to his body, and he was completely healed just instantly. And he became a hardcore Daimista disciple of Mestre Irineu. By hardcore meaning that his community where he was living, Padrinho Sebastião would have to walk, like, oh my gosh, I think 3 or 4 hours to get to Mestre's place, and then do a work, and then walk back in the middle of the night, 3 or 4 hours. And soon he began to, he had a large family of his own. His sons and daughters and his wife began to attend, and then there is aunts and uncles, and then neighbors. And so he began to bring in this very large group of people regularly. They're all walking through, it's sweating, and it's an amazing thing, very regularly, because they were really impressed with this man and this path, and the healing and the light and the love that was available in it. And soon Padrinho Sebastião, he again wasn't Padrinho Sebastião at that point, he was just Sebastião, received permission from Mestre Irineu very, very quickly to make his own daime, and was taught how to make the daime, which is a whole process. And this was not a thing that Mestre did very lightly. And so that, because he knew they had to, the community had to walk so often, so he wanted them to come for the big festival, what they call the festival works, the dance works, but so they could do their own healing works and the smaller sort of like more concentration works with their own community. And so Padrinho Sebastião began, then it started becoming Padrinho Sebastião, because he was the leader of his community, and he started to receive these beautiful hymns. And people he had a whole set of musicians that would come. And so and he would always meet with Mestre, and they had these beautiful conversations, and there was a very close rapport with them. And Padrinho Sebastião was very charismatic. And so when Mestre died, it's always a big issue when you have a religion, what happens when the founder dies. Mm-hmm. And this is a complicated story, because Mestre had left a person, Leoncio Gomes, as the person that would sort of keep running the works, but from Mestre's standpoint, I'm still running the works from what they call from the astral, from above, right? And this guy's job was basically just to keep things going, he wasn't like a successor per se, right? And there was a sort of Padrinho Sebastião kept coming, et cetera, and to make it's a very complicated story, but one of the key issues was at some point Leoncio basically tried to sort of control, like basically say, really all the we here at our church need to be the people that are controlling all the production of the Santo Daime, of the Daime as a sacrament. Basically saying that, you can't do it anymore, Padrinho Sebastião. And Padrinho Sebastião, well, Mestre gave me the permission to do, who are you to take it away? And I mean, again, a lot more complicated than that, but just to give you sort of the essence of it. And so there, at some point, there was a split that happened, not totally, full of animosity, but also not, of course, it was a hard split.
Not with the blessing.
Yeah, it was a hard split, right? And Padrinho Sebastião began to welcome these new arrivals. They were basically hippies coming in from, they call them sort of like mochilhos, I think is a Portuguese word, backpackers or long hairs. And that would come because they were sort of on, they begun to hear about Padrinho Sebastião. They were like heading to Machu Picchu and things like this, and it's sort of on this, began to almost be on the circuit. And he was very welcoming of these people, whereas the people in Alto Santo were not they're so welcoming from new people from what they call from the south, meaning from Rio Branco and from Rio.
Right, from the cities.
Sao Paulo, yeah. Whereas Padrinho Sebastião was. And so there began to be, again, sort of a much more opening towards all sorts of influences that these people brought in. And because Padrinho Sebastião was very open-minded, and actually that community, he began to be really run almost in a purely communistic way, meaning that they decided to just everyone pool their resources so that no one owned anything or everyone owned everything. And it was all sort of a communal process. And so it was really, they're following this man. And then he, at some point, felt the guidance to move from the outskirts of Rio Branco way into the middle of the rainforest where he had come from to begin with. So and that's a whole amazing story, because it was so, they just basically, they got permission from this one Brazilian institution. They found some land and they looked to make sure no one owned it. And they got this called INCRA, said, yes, you guys can, develop this land. And so they spent like 3 years building buildings. I mean, very rustic buildings, but and trying to get it just set up for rubber tapping and farms and things like this, and they had a whole outbreak of malaria. I mean, it's really intense, right? And then just as they're sort of beginning to settle down, this farmer from the south says, by the way, they were wrong, that's my land. And they were wrong. That Brazilian bureaucracy just was not the best. And so they had to get up and and leave and go to a completely new location, which ends up being what's called Céu do Mapiá, where this the location that I really focused the majority of the book on my experiences in. And again, having just sort of hack it out of the dense rainforest with literally machetes and just like basically 40 families coming in there, and just with enormous courage and dedication. It's just like, oh my God, following this one man, right? And his vision and trusting him. Yeah, just to give you a sense of how charismatic he was.
Yeah, he definitely has a presence, that's for sure. I remember the first work I went to, I didn't know much about this tradition. As way of introduction, the person who introduced me sent me a video that was taken from Brazilian television. It was like this little TV documentary that was done on Santo Daime, and it was all in Brazilian Portuguese, obviously, and no translation, but I could see kind of like what the ritual looked like. And I thought, well, this is quite interesting and strange. So I didn't know a whole lot about it because there was just no information and not a lot on the internet at that time. But when I went to my first work, at that time I had a pretty long beard.
Yeah.
And when I walked in, I remember one young guy kind of turned and watched me come in, and his eyes lit up. Now, I'd come in late to the work, so they had already had their first serving of daime. And
Yeah.
so he sees me walking with this long beard, and his face just like lights up, and he smiles and nods knowingly at me. And and then, of course, later I find out that this very prominent figure in the Santo Daime Padrinho Sebastião is known for his like long beard,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think the guy was kind of seeing me as like some follower of Sebastião or some,
Yeah,
who knows
yeah,
what he was seeing, but
I can totally see that.
yeah.
Oh my God.
Now, this is one of the things that's fascinating about Santo Daime is that, like you said, it was very it's not just about the ritual and the doctrine and all of that, but it's also like a social movement.
Yeah,
That's a big component of it, right? And so the founding of Seu do Mapiá, like people could maybe understand it as a kind of spiritual eco community in the
yeah,
middle of the Amazon jungle, right?
yeah,
So you've been there. Could
yeah.
you talk a little bit about what it was like for you to go there? I think maybe in the 90s was your first time, or?
No, no, much later. I got there in 2010.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. Um, and it's changed for I haven't been back since. I was there for almost 3 months, and that's the summer of 2010. And when I went there, what you had to, and this may still be the case, you had to get rent a canoe basically, and a motorized canoe with a little tiny motor in the back. And you just go up this tributary of the Amazon, which is probably 300 feet wide. I mean, it's just huge. And you very quickly just get out of you leave from this little town called Rio Branco. I'm sorry, I'm not Rio Branco. Yeah, from Boca do Acre, which means mouth of Acre. Little tiny frontier town. And you're quickly out of that town, and you're just like for 8 hours surrounded by the Amazon rainforest. And the last 4 hours, because you zip onto this little tributary of this called Igarape Mapiá, which is what the little village is named after. And you go up that like for 4 hours. So it's and it's just like you're just like surrounded by just forest. I mean, it's very close in because the tributary is a lot smaller. And so I got there like just before dark, and with about 5 other people, and didn't really have an idea where I was going to stay. Luckily this one woman had been there before that was on the boat, and she spoke Portuguese, and a Brazilian woman, and we had talked to her ahead of time. So she went up there and arranged for us to place to stay. And so then here I am in this basically sort of an inn, right? But very, very rustic. There's no electricity there. The only electricity they have is generators, which are actually gasoline powered and actually pretty loud, that would in the main city square, where they had just a handful of little tiny stores. But there's houses all around, and it's actually very beautiful. And gosh, I mean, I probably lost 15 pounds when I was there, and it wasn't because I was eating well, but I was just walking all the time and just doing all these work. We did works probably, oh my gosh, sometimes almost like every third day or something, and very intense works,
Yeah, and you're sweating constantly.
It's really hot. And it's and it's sort of disorienting. And of course, you're adding daime into the mix, and it's very like, you're just like, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life, and also one of the most challenging. It was really rigorous. And so I'm so happy I was able to go there, and that's why I chose to write about it, because I felt like it was just sort of like the Mecca of our line, to go there, and so to really be able to meet, all the well, not all, but I mean lots of the really significant elders, and spend time with them and do works with them, and get a sense of what that community was like. And it's by this time, by 2010, they had a pretty beautiful big wooden church that was built in the shape of a six-pointed star, and made just from the hardwoods, made by hand by these people from the hardwoods of the forest. And ended up that after I left, that they had to tear it down because of termites. And so then, the last few years, the people there have been just meeting in a large tent, which is like, oh my gosh, it just, oof. Anyway, and they're building this amazingly beautiful, architecturally rendered, huge, church as well, that they're still in the process of it. Again, COVID and all that. But anyway, it was a very amazing experience. It was very intense, and very beautiful, and very challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think anyone who's been down to the Amazon, for an ayahuasca retreat or for tourism, can really picture your experience being on the little canoe and heading down the tributaries and going under branches and over logs, and
Exactly.
arriving on some riverbank and not quite sure knowing what you're getting yourself into, right?
Yeah.
So like at this time, 2010, like you said, that's pretty recent and pretty late in the development of Mapiá.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it's kind of grown into a town.
Yeah.
Now, is everyone there involved with Santo Daime, or has it attracted non-Daimistas?
Yeah, no, it's a bit of both. It started off, of course, anyone that would be there is by default a Daimista. But at this point, for instance, they were able to get some funding from the Brazilian government. The whole place was turned into basically all the land surrounding it was made into I think like a national forest or preserve or something, and they got permission to stay there and be almost like caretakers of this, and hence the eco village sense. And they got some other money to so for instance, the school there is quite up to date and quite modern, and literally with computers and what have you. And so if you can imagine, if you were in some little village on the outskirts and you hear about this, of course you'd want to send your children to that school. And then people say, oh, well, you got several hundred people there, maybe I can sell things to them. And so little stores began to pop up. So you have I would say, of course, the majority of the people there are Daimistas, but you do have still a significant presence of other people who really don't care that much about the Santo Daime as a path. So that's produces, of course, some sort of tensions, and because they have different priorities and things. And so, yeah, again, part of the lived reality of the Santo Daime tradition is that sort of the social complexities of Sel do Mapiá.
Mm-hmm. Any idea what the population of Mapiá is?
I'm guessing 600, 800 people, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and they're people that it's there are a lot of people, there's some cattle and there's some fields, but really a lot of the people make their living from people outside of the village coming to visit, to do works, especially for the festivals and things. So people have also like lodging houses and things like this, right? And so it's sort of an interesting symbiotic economy there in that way. And so I think that COVID was hard for them. I mean, again, I haven't been there, but I can only imagine, because it had to be shut down, so no visitors could come in.
Right.
It may still be shut down as far as I know.
Great. Thanks for that. Just helping us kind of paint a picture
Yeah, yeah.
of what this kind of mythical, like Mecca-like places. I have friends who went there in the 90s where I think it was quite different, more like what people would imagine as a kind of South American eco-village or something. But yeah,
Yeah,
fascinating.
it's not huts on stilts, which I sort of thought it would be.
Right.
You have some very small, sort of very poor huts and things, but mostly a lot at this point, these are really self-sufficient, very practical, down-to-earth people. And so they've built some pretty nice homes for especially the elders. Um, and they even have a radio station there. And that was a blessing for me because I have a huge antenna so I could actually Skype with my wife during the whole time I was there. That was oh my God, that was so helpful. It kept our marriage going. It was hard, right? To be separated for 3 months without it. So at least I could literally talk to her and she could talk to me and hear me every day.
Oh, yeah, I remember the longest stint I spent in the Amazon was 2 months. And I remember having to hike up to the top of the highest hill in the
Yeah.
area where there was an opening to the sky to try and get a good enough cell reception to even send a text message to let my wife know that I was doing okay. And
Right.
yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to get back to Sebastião and the kind of the innovations or changes that lineage brought in, because to me, Sebastião was like really responsible for Santo Daime spreading out into the world.
Yeah.
One, because like you said, he was so welcoming of outsiders coming in,
Yeah.
where they might have their first introduction to Santo Daime. And then some of them, I guess he granted them the permission to bring it back to their homelands and start up these little
Yeah.
fledgling churches wherever they're from. And
Yeah.
one of those people I've met, a person who brought it to the United States, so Jonathan Goldman,
Sure.
who I know you did your first work with.
Yeah.
So that's like, if people experience Santo Daime outside of Brazil, generally they're going to be experiencing something like what's common in the Padrinho Sebastião lineage, right? Is that fair to say?
I think so. Mostly, I mean, most of the churches, certainly in North America, were a lot of them were started by, for instance, this one elder, Padrinho Paulo Roberto, who was a psychologist down in Rio de Janeiro, um, um, and he ended up married one of Padrinho Sebastião's daughters, became Madrinha Nonata, and Paulo Roberto, a very, in his own right, sort of charismatic figure, started one of the very first churches in the South in Rio, and it's called Céu do Mar. And he ended up also carrying Daime into United States with, being invited by different people to come in, and began to lead works, and just sort of, it was all sort of wild west back then, just, because, to really run a Santo Daime work, you ideally should have a lot of people that are very experienced, that know the hymns, that know how to care for other people. And here he was having just sort of basically pour Daime into people and just handle it on his own. I mean, God bless him. And but he's the sort of constitution that could do that sort of thing. It's acting sort of like a St. Paul to open all these churches. And I think he said again, Jonathan was also very influential, and there's several people that but in the early days, as you mentioned, here in North America, it was really it took a while, but now, to get things sort of settled and where people could be really firm. And it's the same in Europe. I mean, Padrinho Alfredo, who was Padrinho Sebastião's successor, is one of his sons, was really instrumental in setting up the churches there and here in the United States as well. As well as another son, Padrinho Valdeci, And then, you know, you've got other people, like you mentioned, Padrinho, Lex Polari, who wrote that book that you mentioned, the Forest of Visions, which became the religion of ayahuasca, also very influential. So you began to have these tours of these elders that would come around and go to different churches and help to sort of anchor them and get them, you know, more solid and really show them by example, you know, what it meant to be a real Santo Daime church. And then a lot of people would go to Brazil and begin to see that and bring that back. And so it was a lot of cross-pollination was happening. And that's sort of the growth of the Santo Daime in the West.
Yeah, I did a work when Alex Polari and his wife were visiting up in the US. And it was incredible because he was, I believe, a social activist who had been in prison for his activism. And then, like, when I met him, okay, he had the long white beard, like he looked like a wizened old sage. And he really brought a strong kind of Buddhist vibe to the whole work, like lots of silence, like really deep meditations with the lights out with the daime, which was great for me as a kind of naturally inclined mystic and yogi type. I really enjoyed the opportunity to do that. Yeah. So part of like with the elders kind of going on tour or going around is they're helping to keep these fledgling churches kind of in line too, right? Like I remember a lot of correction of how the hymns were sung or pronunciations and things like that.
Oh, for sure. And it's like, I think I don't know if I forget whether I end up including this in the book, but I'll just say it for sure. You know, Daimistas care a lot. Well, let me rephrase. Daimistas actually don't care too much about what you believe. There isn't, of course, there's this notion of the doctrine, but the doctrine is sort of like more like the energetic matrix of the daime, you know, and there are teachings, as you mentioned, teachings through the hymns and things like this. But no, there's no catechism, there's no pope, there's sort of like people like, oh, you need to believe this, you know, there's a lot of flexibility for what you believe. So, but Dionysus care a lot about ritual protocol. A lot. You know, like, so they want those works to be run correctly, you know, and from there, and of course, people being human, there's often different understandings of what it means to run a work correctly. So, you know, it's as they put it in the Santo Daime tradition, it's from one of Mestre Irineo's hymns. It's a fine study, studo fino. You know, it's something to be really examined carefully, that issue. Because you don't want to get it too rigid, but at the same time, you don't want to be too lax either. So you want to have it sort of be welcoming and loving, but also really disciplined. That's, I think, that sort of ideal Santo Daime work. You know, some people are sort of turned off by it because there is a type of you know, people wearing uniforms, you know, and for a dance work, everyone's standing in line, you stand in your place, you know, and there's a lot of emphasis on staying in your place and staying firm. And there's a type of almost military vibe to it, in the sense of like, we're soldiers of the Queen of Heaven, you know, soldiers of love, you know, but it's still soldiers, you know, really erect, really disciplined, really unified, very focused, you know. So it's not sort of, it's a very communal process of Santo Daime. It's not like the more neo-shamanic ayahuasca circles where it's, you have the shaman who's sort of leading with his or her assistants, and then everyone else sort of lies down very passively, you know, just sort of soaking it in essence, right? With this Santo Daime, everyone's sort of a shaman, or, you know, in a sense.
Well, everyone's certainly expected to participate and to kind of hold their own, like you said, kind of contain their energy, to not disrupt other people's inner work, right? Or the flow of the ritual, until it comes to mediumship, which is which is an aspect that I think is specific with Padrinho Sebastião's line. And so it's somewhat controversial, I think, with the more traditional Santo Daime people. But, you know, I've been exposed to it, and I mean, the first work where I experienced mediumship was a giant work, actually. It was February 2nd. So it was Iemanjā's
Oh yeah.
day.
Oh yeah.
So it was a celebration of Iemanjā. And Jonathan Goldman and his wife Jane were leading it. So
Wow.
people had come from all around for this big special celebratory work.
Yeah.
And, you know, halfway through, maybe, I don't know when, but all of a sudden some people start getting up and running around the salao. And one woman, I remember, she was running up and down the halls outside, like screaming like a little kid out in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
playground. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, this is wild.
I know, right?
Totally, I was not, I was not prepared. I did not expect it.
Yeah.
And it was, it's something I really had to um, live with, wrestle with, try to understand what was going on and if it was helpful, if it
Yeah.
was useful. And
Yeah.
I'm still kind of ambivalent about it in terms of coming down on one side or the other. But
Understand.
man, definitely a unique experience.
For sure, right? And yeah, Iemanjā is Queen of the Sea, and one of what they call the Orishas, the deities that came from West Africa, from the Yoruba tradition, right? And so she's the one that is linked with cleansing and often healing, and sort of bringing that maternal divine goddess sort of energy into the
Creative principle, I think she's
yeah.
called in one of the hymns. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And into the salao, that sort of the ritual space. And so yeah, in the book, probably I'd say a third of the book, right, is focused on my talking and thinking through this issue of mediumship, because it's so striking. And it's been a very important and significant part of my own journey, my own spiritual journey. And so I really wanted to think it through. And it's like I say, it is controversial, because like the Alto Santo people are adamantly against it. And even within our own line, there are certain churches that just don't do it much and are a little suspicious of it. And even in the churches that do it, mediums are, the Santo Daime loves to have disciplined people who are controlling themselves and are very self-contained and upright and firm and clear and present and conscious, all those good things. A medium is someone that you don't know what's going to happen, right? And so while mediums are like, yeah, this is so beautiful, especially for a mediumistic work, it's also sort of a potential source of chaos, a potential sort of it can, like it can get out of hand maybe or something. And so there's a type of ambivalence even in churches that consciously and clearly embrace mediumship, in terms of, because they know it's sort of like there's a lot of learning and training to become a medium. And the first early stages, it's often very wild. Yeah. And people's bodies and like the sounds they make and the movements they're making. And there's this whole interplay between, as Jonathan mentions in the book, Jonathan Goldman, I remember it so distinctly, him talking about that. Like I say, there's always three elements to mediumship. There's inspiration, ego, and drama.
Sure.
So
yeah.
You want to link up more with the first and diminish the second two, but there's always going to be some, of those other two, of ego and drama. And because, you're a human being. And so it's,
it's about discernment, right? And
exactly.
like trying to one of the first hymns that we would sing is called Examine Your Conscience.
Yeah.
And it comes out first, and it's like kind of setting things up. Like, so if you start to feel some energy taking you over and like you want to start physically expressing or vocally expressing it, it's kind of up to you to examine your conscience and say, where is this coming from? Is this some unintegrated part of myself that is being boisterous or wants attention or wants to feel special? Or is this authentic? And I mean, that's got to be like just a constant examination and reconsideration.
Oh, without a doubt. And I mean, I know when I first started, because the opposite can be true too. Not the opposite, but I mean, there's sort of a flip side of that is that, like, I was very shy about these sort of things. And I did not want to do anything to disrupt anyone. I didn't. And yet there was another part of me that was like, I also wanted to honor those energies and those beings. And part of my own sort of spiritual training before I even got into the Daime had to do with doing sort of neo-Reichian work to sort of free up the bodily armoring and things like this. And Jonathan Goldman was also sort of
Like
trained in that.
Wilhelm Reich and
Wilhelm
like
Reich,
bioenergetics, that kind of thing.
exactly, right, with like Alexander Lowen and that sort of training. And so I've been training, working with people and trying to help people in group settings to sort of open themselves up bodily, because we, as especially in, you know, in America, we tend to be pretty often, at least many people tend to be sort of locked down or locked tight energetically, and so being not feeling very free to move and express themselves physically. And so on the other hand, I was really appreciative of that freedom that was there in the works as a medium, to be able to just experiment and let those, not experiment, it's not quite, because that's more conscious, but to let those energies play out. And but I was really clear that I said it had to be a really clear, like, tug on the sleeve, like, you need to get out there. I said, I do not want any, you know, I don't want to be going in there exactly. I don't want to be like just showing off or I wanted to make sure it was authentic, right? And I always have. You know, but when it gets in there, then it can become pretty dramatic, you know, if you let it open up.
Yeah.
It's like it's often not so I remember, but I write about this, you know, because my very first work with Jonathan was a very strongly a mediumistic work, and that was my first exposure to the Santo Daime. And I'm like, woo, what is this? A similar sort of thing. I didn't know what to expect, and there's like people crying and laughing and, you know,
hooting and hollering and
exactly, moving their bodies around, and I'm like, whoa, okay, you know. I say I have the same thing.
This ain't your grandma's church.
I know, right? Or maybe actually in my case it's sort of close, because it's sort of like a, you know, Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, right?
Yeah, right. Which we don't have much of up here in Canada. So
yeah. So my lineage is more like up in the hills in North Carolina, you know. So
well,
like
we're mostly Protestant, so it's like the exact opposite of that. Where
so anyway, so it's I don't know. I mean, it's a very fascinating issue, because I mean, obviously I wrote, you know, hundreds of pages about this, really not hundreds, but I mean, you know, at least 100 pages about this very issue in the book, because it raises all sorts of issues around who we are as human beings too. Because when you begin to feel this sort of like superimposition of different consciousnesses within your consciousness, that's fascinating, you know. So you can have works, and I have works where I would be like, okay, here's my own sort of egoic consciousness, but then I'd feel also this presence of these beings of light, you know, these really, you know, who knows, but beings with a lot of love and compassion and clarity and light, you know. And so they'd be superimposed on my energetic field, or my field, my consciousness. And then here in would come these, what we call these suffering spirits, these disembodied beings who are seeking healing, that are suffering, and they're very contracted. And so you got these like at least 3 different levels simultaneously of coexisting consciousnesses within the one field of my own being. I'm like, what? You know, and then all the movements and whatever, which I begun to really appreciate, because I like a spirituality that's embodied. You know, I like because, you know, another strand of my own spiritual background is sort of, you know, tantric and yogic, right? And so Tantra is all about spiritualization of every moment of existence, and especially the spiritualization or the consecration or sacralization of the body, right? And so I write about this in the book too. I don't work too hard to, you know, I don't say that the Santo Daime is tantric, but there's a lot of fascinating overlaps in this way, because it's both traditions, and I could actually list several, but certainly at least in the focus on the sacralization of the body. That's what I think mediumship at its highest is, right? It's and it's a very, because in the Daime, especially when you're working with these suffering spirits, it's like understood to be we call it giving charity, you know, so that it's like you're wanting to help these beings who are really suffering and helping them to move on, helping them to receive grace, helping them to feel love and unconditional forgiveness and things like this that they often really don't deserve. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful process of helping them to become free and to receive that love and grace, and to act as sort of, again, a medium, as a vessel, as a channel for that process to happen.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, yeah. Thanks for that. I mean, this is something that I've wrestled with, and like I said, I'm still on the fence about it.
Yeah.
In terms of where I stand with my belief. Like, one way to view this is that it's a literal incorporation of a disembodied spirit, and it brings with it its own suffering, its own consciousness, its own experience and trauma and everything, and it's coming into your body and you're experiencing it or working with it. The other way to view it is that, well, these are literalized aspects of myself that have been repressed, that the Daime is helping to open my psyche up to, and it's like psychedelic. It's revealing something of my psyche that I've been unconscious of. So kind of, I guess you would say, like, ontologically, you could have these two different viewpoints, like what's actually going on here. But where I've just kind of come into acceptance about it all, and acceptance of my ambivalence as well, I don't think it really matters at the end of the day. In the experience, I experience it as literally real, as literally happening. And I just found it's best to go with it. Like, I think Jung would say, to act as if, like when working with archetypal figures from dreams or imagination, like try to put aside your literal, rational thinking mind and act as if, and that's going to have the healing benefit for your overall psyche. So that's where I'm at with it. I mean, have you come to a place where you feel strongly one way or the other?
No, actually I don't, because I write, that's part of all this, my writing in the book is trying to, I really wrestle with that exact issue. And because I tend to be sort of a paradoxical both and thinker. And so I have no trouble saying that it's both. And I do think it's actually both, and way beyond anything that, because, we're trying, I stress this a lot too, with both the visionary mystical experiences and mediumship. We're playing in areas where, like, I give this analogy of like I actually give two analogies. One would be like a goldfish is scooped out of its little bowl and it's just flopping around in someone's hand, some giant's hand, and it's like doesn't know what the hell's going on, it just, and then finally gets put back in its safe little confines of what it's. We're sort of like that in these experiences. There's this whole other vast realms, and this I'm sure of, multi-dimensional universe that we just get little tiny peeks into, either through the visionary experiences, sort of like ascending into those worlds, or with mediumship, that those worlds, those energies are descending into us or arising from within us. But they're always arising within us, right? And so there does always have to be, I think, something within us that is resonant with all those different levels of energy. And there has to be, so that I think like with the suffering spirits, for instance, that what I've noticed is that I'll have a little something, I mean, some maybe, maybe it's more than little, but it's certainly there's a landing place, there's an opening for that, what feels like a very strongly other being to come in.
Right. Yeah. So if I have some repressed anger in my heart,
Yeah.
I might attract a quote unquote suffering spirit that wants to express anger and rage through me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, right.
Or addiction or grief, all of that. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And so who knows at what, because one thing I will say is I do think that we are multidimensional without a doubt. And so the issue is like, even when we say like, it's almost like just from our subconscious, like we don't know how far and how deep our subconscious goes into.
Mm-hmm.
You start looking at these Jungian archetypes, these archetypal energies coming in. Jung would even talk about them as, having their own, their own intention, they initiate these, they're what bring up the dreams.
He would say that they're autonomous, that they're like God-sized energies. So he didn't downplay.
What's self, what's other, it becomes a real fascinating investigation. And with the Santo Daime, you get to actually be, your own body and mind becomes the laboratory where you get to really experiment and experience these things. It's not just reading about it from a distance. That's
right. That's one of the reasons why I was so attracted to it, and I stuck with it for a while, is because like I saw it as the only real Christian mystery school that was like still around and active and had a sacrament that actually worked to do what it's supposed to do.
Right.
And so it's like, it's very Gnostic in that way. Like it's about knowing for yourself, or not knowing, but at least experiencing for yourself.
That's a good distinction. I like that, because the other analogy I was giving about for the not knowing that I give in the book is from William James, and he's saying it's like, a dog coming into a library. The dog sees the same books, but he doesn't have a clue. They don't have a clue what books are, or more or less what words and meanings are, right?
Yeah, like if a dog could speak, he'd be like, well, what do I do with this?
I know,
like,
right?
Kind of what we do with our experiences sometimes, right?
It's sort of like that, we're in this whole vast, mysterious universe, and we're doing our best.
Well, yeah, I appreciate how you've written about it in the book. Now, would you say that there are some inherent dangers to experimenting with mediumship? And you could speak specifically about doing it within the container of the Daime or outside of it. Up to you.
Well, it's a really good question, and it's a valid question. It's a worthwhile question exploring, and I just tend to be a little careful with it, because while I think it's good for people to be careful, I think people already have so much fear around this issue, at least some people, that I don't want to stoke that fear. You know what I'm saying? Because I feel personally, and there are people who would disagree with me about this, but my own experience has been within the container of the Santo Daime work, with working with people that are very well-trained mediums that know what to do with this, that know how to bring in a lot of light and protection, from these higher beings, from these beings of light, and know how to work with this, and how to work with people in their process, and to help to train mediums like Bashinya did with Jonathan, and now Jonathan's doing, and other people as well. I felt completely safe with it, and I, especially with the sacrament, like I've had some conversations online with people who have basically say, it's the last thing you want to do is to do all this mediumship stuff, and then you throw in the hallucinogenic on top of it, and it just makes it worse. And I'm like, to me, it's like, that's what makes me feel much safer, actually, because the Daime, I feel just like whatever is being brought up is being brought up in the context of to me, like the Daime is not just a chemical, or set of chemicals. It's the physical, it's a true sacrament. So it's a physical embodiment of a spiritual consciousness of seemingly infinite proportion. I have no idea how huge for us, when in the Santo Daime, it's literally it's incarnating the spirit of the Christ, right? That's big. And so I feel very safe when I'm working with that, because I've got that sort of with me, protecting me, holding me, right? But that's my own experience. Other people, I do think that, there might be people, what I have no, because this is a whole discussion within the Santo Daime. The only people I think that should not be involved with the Santo Daime, or should not be drinking Daime, are people with severe mental health issues. By severe, meaning like tendencies towards, psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar, or maybe even borderline personalities. That's not the ideal sort of person that I think maybe even I would say, if you had an extremely structured 24-hour residential situation, could probably still benefit from it. But most people don't have that, right? And so you add mediumship into the mix for someone like that, that's not ideal, right? But I don't think it's ideal for them to be drinking Daime, period. Right? And so that's the main area of concern I would have.
Yeah.
And you can't always predict that, right?
Well, yeah, that's kind of one of the criticisms of even having any kind of open mediumship happening, is that it might bring out something that's been latent in someone, especially with the powerful sacrament. And I think, like, for me, like, one of the dangers is actually of literalism. I remember going to a work, and there was a young man there who had the kind of standard stereotypical Christ complex. Like, he literally thought that he had opened himself in a work to Christ consciousness, and that he was then the incarnation of Christ. And I think some of that belief was supported in the community. I think there is a tendency, because of belief, to take things literally. And I feel like that young man could have benefited from a talk about deliteralizing it, and talking about how maybe what he's experiencing was his potential for Christ consciousness in himself, and that he wasn't literally the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. But I didn't hear that conversation happening. And so I had misgivings about that, and concerns about that, and wondering how prevalent that kind of thing actually is.
I agree.
But there's also something about the way that it was handled. So he was allowed into the work, but he wasn't given any Daime for that work. But there was, I guess, the belief that by being in the presence of others and being in the ritual ceremony, that he would receive any healing that he may have needed. But that was, one experience that I don't think is completely uncommon. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
It's such a beautiful insight and comment, and sort of sad too, because I write about this in the book. I think that, and not only with the Santo Daime tradition, with any tradition that's working with psychedelic substance, even just on a therapeutic healing level, that the potential for grandiosity and inflation is huge. It just is. And so it needs to be really openly, overtly talked about. And there needs to be it needs to be addressed skillfully when it arises. And I mean, I'm basically, I completely agree with you with that. It's something that, because it's I mean, and it's understandable. I don't even there, I think that there's, if it's handled skillfully, it's just sort of a bump on the road. It's just part of the learning process, right? It's not the end of it. It's not like, ideally someone has this beautiful experience of their connection with the Christ or with God, and that their oneness. I mean, that's a whole, thing with the Eastern traditions, right? Of that, the sense of experiential union or identity with this divine source, right? And that's sort of the end point, or at least one of the goals of lots of these, mystical traditions. And so it's something that I think, on the one hand, is good to nurture, but you're right. When it becomes linked in with the ego, then it gets to be really problematic. And so it's like, I remember, I'm sure, well, you may have the book Be Here Now by Ram Dass, and
Sure, yeah.
a spiritual teacher, right? And he talks about his brother who was institutionalized, and
right,
was Jesus and stuff like that, something similar. And Ram Dass making the point that it's like, the difference between my brother and me is that he thought only I am Jesus, right? Whereas a mystic is aware, yes, I am the Christ, but so are you. And so the Christ is in everything and in everyone, right? And that's a huge difference. And I think that what you find at its best in the Santo Daime is this interplay between wondrous experiences of connection to these different strata of divinity, combined with a real emphasis at its best on humility. And on, like, we're a work in progress, right? We're doing our best. And, so, I don't know. I mean, I probably would have, I have a lot of faith in the power of the healing potential of the Santo Daime work. I probably would have also, I think I also have a lot of faith in, for certain people, the need for them to have good one-on-one therapy from a skilled therapist, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, seriously, and many Daimista friends of mine, for instance, go to do that work.
And maybe not a conventional psychotherapist, but someone more like a spiritual counselor who can walk in both worlds and speak the language of both and with them.
Yeah, at least a psychotherapist that is conversant in and open to the power of plant medicines. And
well, and I think who also has an understanding of like archetypal psychology too, to understand the power of these forces.
Exactly.
Like I know when some people they'll psychologize these kind of experiences, right? And it will be, well, of course you had this experience, but it's a part of your own psyche, and it was intensified by the hallucinogen that you'd taken. So of course it's going to seem wholly real and not of yourself and all of that kind of thing. But I can't help but think that almost is a way to defend against the numinosity of the experience, which is a word that you use. It comes from Otto.
Yeah.
But it's meant to point to something that's so terribly vast and unknowable, the mysterium tremendum of the divine experience. And like Jung said, any encounter with the numinous is experienced as a defeat by the ego. So I see sometimes how like psychology, even like depth psychology or archetypal psychology, can be used as a kind of defense against these incredible experiences that I think anyone who spent enough time in those realms will just have to say, like, end up with the, I don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I would hope it's a combination of, I've had amazing insights and I don't know what the world just happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well,
Again, there's that both and that I think at its best, because I think it's good to be able to sort of say, to acknowledge that we can have definite, what James would call noetic insights into profound downloads into the nature of reality, the nature of the mysterium tremendum, because we are part of that. We're not like cut off from it. That's to my mind, our aspect of our true nature, really.
of our birthright, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. And we want to be growing into that, right? And to have enormous sense of we're just like scratching on the frost of the tip of the iceberg of what's really going on. So let's stay real humble. Let's stay real, like we're growing. We're doing our best, and with God's grace and the grace of the goddess, the Divine Mother, we'll keep moving. you know.
Well, and like when the rubber hits the road, how is it benefiting your life, and what kind of person are you in your life, right? Like, I don't care what someone's theology or what their beliefs are. For me, it's all about, well, how do they show up in the world? What kind of contribution are they making? Is their spiritual practice, whatever it is, how crazy it might seem to me, I don't care if it's like kind of working for them, you know?
Exactly. No, I mean, that's in the book. I give a real, actually pretty long chapter about that very issue, because I think it's so central, because it's like, and how do we evaluate the complexities of evaluating, is it working? And what are the criteria by which we look at that, right? And so this is where, because a lot of the book I'm drawing upon, of course, my background with William James and Bergson, and James actually has a whole thing about that, which he talks about in the varieties. It's sort of like proto-pragmatism in essence, right? Where he gives these three criteria of, assessing the value and validity of a mystical experience, right? And the first one is immediate luminosity, which is like the immediate, like sort of direct force of that mystical experience, which he takes very seriously as a source of, like that if it's that strong, you have to take it seriously. But then he talks about philosophical reasonableness, which is sort of saying, okay, I've had this experience. Can I make sense of it within a broader philosophical framework? And by philosophy, it doesn't mean like, necessarily explicitly, but, like just what we're doing. We're trying to put words to it. We're trying to make a coherent set of explanations and put meaning to it. And can it be like that, articulated in that way? And then third, which goes directly to your point, is like, it's what he calls moral helpfulness, which is Victorian prose for, he doesn't mean like, moral codes or things like that, which is maybe part of in terms of, you would hope you become a more ethical person or a good person, basically. But also, like, basically he says, like, do you see yourself and your community on the whole and over the long run, which is the two important sort of qualifiers, getting better, right? So on the whole, growing as your community, getting better over the long run. Like, so maybe you're going to feel like you're getting worse in the beginning, but over on the long run, is it the telos, is the thrust, can you feel a movement towards getting better? And I don't think anyone would stay in a spiritual path unless they felt that was the case, right? And then how they make that case.
That's the thing, is that they can lose perspective.
Exactly right. And that's why the philosophical reasonableness becomes really important, because you want to be really clear and conscious and thoughtful and begin to sort of like examine other possibilities. And that's part of what I wrote the book for, right? Is to begin to sort of like say it's important to have these conversations, and I really appreciate actually a lot of the Daimistas. We talk with each other a lot, and like trying to digest what's going on. And Daimistas tend to be a little reticent about sharing their own experiences. And I think rightfully so. You don't want to be like grandiose about it again. It's just, keep it very private, very sacred. But still there needs to be, and I talk about this in the book, that there's a value of that sort of give and take of conversation where people bounce ideas off each other. And so that can help to sort of keep people from being too solipsistic and isolated in their self-understandings, right?
Mm. Yeah, that was a main difference between Santo Daime and the way ayahuasca is kind of usually drunk at like a retreat center in the Amazon, or probably up here too, although I've never done that. But a common element of the neo-shamanic, or even if it's kind of like indigenous traditional Shipibo, but it's usually done in a westernized context, right? Which brings its own stuff to it. But a part of that is the sharing circle after the ceremony. And after sitting through dozens and dozens of those while I was working in a center, you know, I'm not sure that's the best way to quote unquote integrate your experience, is sharing it with a large group of people where it's really a monologue.
Yeah.
I thought that brought out a lot of the grandiosity that you're talking about here, or the, um, making things like quite dramatic and maybe getting stuck in your story about how things are. Like it's solipsism within a group context because people wouldn't get challenged or asked about things. On the other hand, in the Daime, what was nice is that there was always time for communal gathering after these long works where you'd have a potluck and
Yeah.
people would maybe pair up or go off in little groups, but you'd end up having these conversations about like, what the hell just happened there? Or did you have this kind of experience? And, for me, going to people with more experience and bouncing things off them, I always found an attitude of like a non-dogmatic attitude toward hearing me out and offering some reflections on things.
Yeah.
In the end, what was always the case in my experience was people valuing uh, the reality of my experience, and maybe just offering some helpful tips or guidance along the way to help me make some sense of that or make some good use of it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a very
Yeah.
different approach, like not the same kind of focus on telling your story and talking about all the details of your wild experience the night before. That was actually seemed like it was not encouraged so much.
It depends, like you probably saw it some, like in my first works with Jonathan, for instance, he would, with those, they're a little more, they would have those sharing circles. And with Padrinho Alex, when I did a retreat with him down in Mawa and in the mountains outside of Rio. And he would do those occasionally. And I found those very valuable in the sense that if you have a skilled person who's running them and who can and will work to sort of work with the person and challenge their story and keep them on track and things like that, then I found it really helpful because it's valuable sometimes to get insights from someone who's really had a lot of depth of experience and they can sort of shine a light onto things. And but I also like, and I talk about this in the book, I also do very much value just, I think you said it so beautifully, that sort of just real casual sort of after work, just talking. And I sometimes though, because sometimes I sort of feel a little in my participation with Santo Daime, I sort of wish there was a little more time actually for it, because sometimes these works go really late and people just, they want to just put it up and go home, they're tired.
Yeah.
Right. And so what happens though, even then, because, and this is something that I talk about in the, this is why it's a religion, right? And a religion creates a community, and a community bounces off each other and they talk to each other and they squabble and there's a friction and a support that's both sides, I think, extremely valuable for growth, actually.
Yeah.
So
And the community is an organism that's
yeah.
dynamic, but I think will be self-correcting ultimately, right? So a lot of those kind of personal disagreements kind of get ironed out if the community sticks together and has that commitment to stay together.
No, exactly, right, because they almost have to, right?
Yeah.
And it gets messy at times, but that's just part of the process. And it's a way to learn, like, how can I come back to my heart? How can I let go of my anger? How can I really forgive and allow myself to be forgiven? And how can I receive correction? How can I, not be so nice and have to give some pointers to someone, or all those sort of dynamics that are extremely important and really healing, and for a community and personally, I think,
Yeah, especially a human being who's trying to recover the ability to live in community again after being, in these isolated little
Right,
nuclear families and, more and
exactly.
more atomized existence.
Good point.
This is like one more thing I think that's connected to this that I wanted to talk with you about, and then I think we could wrap it up there. But so, how do I want to get into this? How do I want to lay this in there? Yeah, because it has to do with community. Do I want to go there? This is one of those parts that I edit out as I wrestle with like what's the best way into this.
For sure.
I think I'm going to leave it actually, because it might open up things too much, and I don't want to just kind of leave something out there hanging that I want to do justice to.
Sure. And there's all these, I mean, to me, it's like, I mean, we've covered a ton, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think if there's anything that, like from the book for sure that we didn't cover that I think would be important. And, I mean, I think that one of the things, because the end of the book really, it all sort of points towards there's a sort of a momentum that happens in the book, right? And it's leading towards the end of the book, which is, and I consciously wanted to end with this, the discussion of divinization, because it's like, what's the goal of all this? What's the end point? And why are we doing this, right? And of course, there's no just one answer to that. Everyone's gonna have their own answer to that. But when I talked to both Padrinho Alex Polari, and when I interviewed him, and several interviews actually, and then also this woman who runs this place called the Santa Casa in Seu de Mapiá, which to me was one of the most beautiful, holy. Santa Casa means like holy house, and it's very much felt that way. These beautiful works most mornings there that I participated in. And Isabel Barceo is sort of one of the founders of this. And so I interviewed the two of them and talked to them about this. What's the goal of this? And they both felt it was it's all beautiful, that everyone has their own level of working and their own sense of where we're heading, and what it means to be a good daimista, right? But for them, it meant awakening to that I am principle within, and the divine self within, and beginning to link up with that and to embody that as much as possible within your own body and mind, so that you become a conduit of these divine energies, of these divine qualities of basically, light and forgiveness and compassion and wisdom, and all these divine energies, which is talked about in early Christianity as divinization, right? And so again, just to me, that's really sort of the goal of the Santo Daime, is for each of us to, within our own unique way, like you were talking about very early, that sort of, which I love, that sort of our own sort of prismatic angle to that light, to embody that, right? And to be a vehicle of those energies of healing, of insight, of compassion in this world that so desperately needs it, right? And so,
Yeah, and to continually kind of polish that facet, so that divine light comes through more clearly and is not blocked or obscured or distorted in some way.
exactly, right. And to be that, have that sort of very clear self-examination that can happen. And
Examinia conscientia. Like
Yeah.
right there, first hymn of the night. Bang.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, for me, it was like it was summed up so clearly and beautifully in the symbolism of the crucero, this double barred cross that is the central symbol of the Daime. It's, on every altar, and you've got one there behind you. But the way it was explained to me early on was that that second horizontal bar of the cross represents the second coming of Christ,
Yeah,
which was
yeah.
meant to happen in the hearts of all humanity and would be facilitated through this particular sacrament. And I
Exactly.
mean, God, sounds good to me, man. Like,
No, seriously, right?
yeah,
May it be
like
so.
whatever the way to that is, I can stand behind that
Yeah.
aspiration or that doctrine for sure.
No, no, for sure. And then, and like you said, with that examine your conscience, like Magina, he does it, examine your conscience. It's the first lesson. Padrinho Sebastião was talking, that's him we were singing of his. And it's like, it's such a prevalent understanding. And it's fascinating too. This is a small little thing, but to me, it's fascinating because I love Portuguese. And in the Portuguese, consciência means both conscience and consciousness. So examine your conscience is the first lesson, like it's often how it's translated with Madrina Hita, but it also means examine your consciousness, examine the depths of your consciousness, right? And I think with Padrinho Sebastião and Madrina Hita, it's clear that it's both, right? And so it had this sort of dual thing where it's like, on the one hand, like, really check in with what your conscience is saying about how you should live your life in an upright, sort of good way, but also look in the depths of your own consciousness to find that divine source and keep looking there, So I just love that,
Yeah, I love that too. I love those kind of double meanings.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that actually.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah.
nice.
It has a simultaneity there with meaning.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the way I kind of shorthand think of conscience is like the inner voice of God, that's can be corrective and can sound judgmental and critical, like patriarchal, but it's trying to keep you living in a right way. That's how I help people try to distinguish between that and some other unhelpful part of the psyche or more, I don't know.
The superego sort of stuff, which is
Yeah,
much
but like
harsh
for
and
me,
you know.
yeah, right. Yeah, the abusive father or something like that, or yeah. Um, but in the hymn, it says, examine your conscience.
Yeah,
And if I'm thinking about conscience in that way, it's like not really mine. So it makes sense to me that it also means consciousness or examine your mind, right?
yeah, no, exactly. So it has both meanings, and because the English you have to sort of pick one, and it often in the translation say conscience, and so I'm like, so in my back of my mind going, what also means this other thing, which is really important.
Right. Yeah. Just don't look to the big daddy in the sky for guidance, but
Exactly,
correct
exactly, right?
yourself, right?
Exactly, right? And find that divine source within, find that connection, within you, and way beyond you. I mean, but within your depths, for sure, within your heart.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
Bill, this has been really great. And
sure, Brian.
like I said, I've been wanting to talk about this for years now, but for reasons that we discussed, it can be hard to find people within the tradition who want to speak about it openly or talk about their experience because there's the issues of humility and proselytization. And so I think it took someone like you who's an academic, but also an insider, to
Yeah,
be able to come forward and speak about it in a really kind of personal way, but also has a good understanding of all the different aspects of it and the tradition and everything. So I think it worked out perfectly. I had to wait, 4 years, but that's cool.
oh, it's been a delight, seriously, to talk with you. Just a delight. And these sort of conversations mean so much to me personally, and that's I feel so privileged and honored to be able to, be a catalyst for these conversations and to be able to sort of just participate and learn. And it's a sort of infinity sign of giving and receiving and learning and teaching that happens in these conversations that I just find really uplifting and helpful.
Yeah, that's great. So the website is liquidlightbook.com.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
And there, everyone's going to, like we talked about, find all kinds of resources about the Santo Daime if you want to find out more and, how to follow along with what you're doing, I guess.
Yeah, and also you could get a 20% off buying the book from Columbia University Press. There's a code on there that's there. So
that's good, because those academic presses, they like to overcharge for their books.
Well, I don't know about overcharge, because they have to somehow make money somehow, because these guys are really, but you're right. They're sometimes like, ooh, pricey.
Yeah, I went to buy, someone I had on the podcast went to buy one of his books on Kindle, and the Kindle edition of his book was like $65, which was, that's where I get the overcharging things. There's not even like the paper. Come on.
Oh, come on.
Oh, Bill, this has been great. Thanks again. And we'll see you down the road.
Okay, man. Blessings to you.
Take care.
Bye.
Blessings. Bye-bye.
The Medicine Path is produced by Brian James on unceded Coast Salish territory, Vancouver Island, Canada. For more information, visit brianjames.ca. Music by Olive Artesoni, aka Greenhouse. Join the Medicine Path tribe and gain early access to episodes and the full podcast archives at patreon.com/Medicine Path. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rain fall soft upon your fields. Until the next time we meet on the Medicine Path.